The Strangeworlds Travel Agency by L.D. Lipinski. Beside the church, leaning drunkenly into the alleyway, was a tiny, squashed-looking shop with a big bay window. It had a shiny black door and a corner porch with a stone step so worn it appeared to be melting into the pavement. Flick looked up at the sign. The Strangeworlds Travel Agency. Something prickled under her skin. The feeling wasn't unpleasant. If she'd had to describe it, she would have said it was curiosity mixed with oranges. She felt her fingers curl into her palms in an involuntary clench that sent a sort of electric feeling through her bones. She wanted to get closer to that shop. She couldn't say exactly why. The travel agency, if that's what it really was, looked the same as the other shops on the street. Old, unpopular, rather unloved, and as though it might have a bit of a weird smell. It did have fresh red and gold paint spelling out its name, though, and a gleaming glossy globe at either end of the sign. There was also a brass plaque beside the door, though at this distance Flick couldn't make out what it said. Her legs, moving almost without permission, took her across the cobblestone road and up to the shop before she could think of a reason not to. The porch had a bit of an overhang to shelter people from rain, and once under it Flick felt as if she was standing in a little cocoon. She brushed her hand against the sandy brickwork, and some of the dusty masonry clung to her fingers. She rubbed it off on the leg of her jeans and touched the brass plaque bolted to the outside wall. It was dented and scratched. It had also been vandalised. The letters were scoured as though they'd been attacked with a chisel. Flick could just make out the letters O-C-I-E-T-Y. She studied the big bay window. The glass, shining in the sunlight, seemed to look back at her. Flick realised the shop wasn't really so grubby after all. It was sort of beautiful. Like a book that's been read so many times the cover has fallen off and the pages have started to curl, or a soft bear that's had all its fur loved away. Flick felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. There was a soft, affectionate feeling growing in her chest that she couldn't explain, like the sort of feeling you get when you see a photograph of a person taken before you meet them. You recognise them and you'll know you're going to meet them someday, but it's as though they're not quite ready. Not yet. She put her hand on the door and pushed. The door swung open easily and she stepped in after it, catching it before it could bang against the wall. It closed softly behind her, letting out a dusty sigh as it settled back into place. Flick looked around. She had never seen anywhere that looked less like a travel agency in her life. The air was slightly dusty, almost as though the place had a sepia filter thrown over it. The wall to Flick's left was a mosaic of luggage. Dozens of different sized suitcases were slotted into perfectly proportioned holes of varnished dark wood. Only one single cavity was empty. To her right, in the corner behind the door, was a glass and wood cabinet stuffed to bursting with books and files and tiny knickknacks and a glass case of insects. Beside this corner cabinet was a stretch of wood-panelled wall that was home to a dozen photographs in heavy, dark frames. The pictures were all of people. Flick frowned as she looked at them closely. There were tiny plaques beneath each picture with barely readable names engraved into them. To the back of the room there was a bookcase, stuffed into a corner beneath the stairs, and in front of the bookcase was a desk. There was enough space between it and the bookcase for a leather-cushioned swivel chair. The desk was littered with books and papers and a wrapper from a packet of custard creams. Goosebumps rose on Flick's arms as she stared around at the suitcases, the twin armchairs either side of the empty fireplace to the right, and the mantelpiece with a synchronous of clocks on the top of it. There was a faint smell of blown-out candle and something like damp paper. It felt familiar and new at the same time. It felt like somewhere she probably shouldn't be. And yet Flick didn't even think once about going for the door. She walked carefully over to the mantelpiece. The clocks on it were all ticking at different speeds. The hands of some were whizzing round the faces, others seemed to be barely moving at all, and each one had a label. Cove of Voices, Flick read aloud. Aquata Minor, Crystal Forest. She picked up one of the clocks. The label on it read, City of 5 Lights. It was ticking merrily and quickly. It was a small, black and round clock, like a cartoon alarm clock, but so heavy and greasy that when she turned it over, it immediately slipped from her fingers. She scrambled and bent to catch it before it could crash onto a couple of leather-bound suitcases that were stacked between 2 chairs. She breathed a sigh of relief and shook her head at the clock as if it had decided to jump out of her hands on its own. She carefully put it back where it belonged. That was close. Flick jumped like she'd been stung and looked around to see who had spoken.